the Rotman Institute, Research Institute at Baycrest, and she has done some really interesting work on bilingualism with children and their cognitive development, and that you've now extended this to older people, and that what you're finding is that this bilingualism has some type of preventative, not preventative, but a kind of a shield for older people not to become cognitively demented or whatever, right? No, it's really interesting stuff. This is a new reason why we should have more bilingualism in this country. So I leave it to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to give you an overview of this research so you'll have kind of the big picture. I'm going to talk about sort of good and bad things about bilingualism, and I'm going to talk about the whole lifespan. I'll have little bits on children and some on older adults, and try to put it together into what I think is a very coherent story that unites all of these little pieces. Now first let's have a look at bilingualism, because it turns out bilingualism is not as rare as some people might think. If you want to think about a country that is the antithesis of bilingual, you'd probably think of the United States. But even there, statistics show that a surprising proportion of Americans are bilingual. Now, if you just look at Hispanic Americans, the projections are that in a very short time they will outnumber non-Hispanic Spanish-speaking Americans. So lots of, these are data from 2006, show well over 50 million people in the United States are fully bilingual. In Canada, we're not surprised to know that a much larger proportion is bilingual. These are now old data. This is the 2001 census that shows at least 1/3 of the population is bilingual, but I think it's more than that because the census doesn't have detailed enough questions to know. But if we go worldwide, it's enormous. And David Crystal, who is a linguist, estimates that 2/3 of children in the world are raised in bilingual environments. So this is not a boutique experience. This is very mainstream and increasing. So what I want to look at is how living as a bilingual may have implications for language and cognitive function. I'm going to start with language. Now, if you would think that bilingualism might affect something, you'd be most likely to say it would affect language. It is a linguistic experience. If something will change because of it, most likely it would be language. What you would probably not guess is that the way it affects language is negatively, by and large. So bilingual children typically have a smaller vocabulary in each language than monolingual children. Now that's not to say they have a smaller overall vocabulary. Bilingual children know lots of words, but when they're functioning in just one of their languages, they know, on average, fewer words than monolingual children. With adults, we don't look at the number of words they know because that varies so much in an adult population. But we look at how rapidly and how efficiently they can retrieve specific words. Quick, what's the name of that thing you use to turn over eggs? How fast can you come up with that? That's the kind of thing that bilingual adults are slower at, it's harder, and they make more mistakes. So linguistic representations, or what we know about words, to keep it simple, is less rich and less interconnected, less automatically retrieved for bilinguals than for monolinguals. Now I have some data to show you. This is a study that we did. This is actually not a study we did. This is a combination of many, many studies we did to look at vocabulary in bilingual children. Now, whenever we do research in my lab with children, we always give them a vocabulary test in English. So we had lots and lots of data lying around from this very same vocabulary test. And since it's it's exactly the same test, administered under exactly the same conditions, we were able to combine the results from a large number of children. So what you have here is the average results from over 1,700 children. Now, this test is scaled so that 100 is the mean. It's just like an IQ scoring. 100 is the mean with standard deviations of 15, okay? Now, red is monolingual and blue is bilingual, and that will be the case for all slides I show you, so you don't have to squint and try to read the legends. Blue is always bilingual. Now, if you look, you can see that between the ages of 3 and 10 years old, over a large number of children that we test for a variety of reasons in our lab, everybody is within the normal range. Everybody is within one standard deviation. These are not kids who have any kind of special needs, special talents. They're normal, ordinary kids, but the bilinguals always score lower at every age. So that's what I mean by on average. Bilingual children know fewer words, in this case, in English. And all of these bilingual children, and there's something like 900 or 1,000 of them in this sample, they go home and they speak something else. They speak Italian, Portuguese, Chinese, French. They speak a million different things. But it makes no difference. This is their English results. Now, if we look at the other point about language, I said that verbal retrieval, the ability to select effortlessly a particular word that you want, is poorer in bilingual adults. There's lots of studies showing this. If you just show pictures and measure the naming time in milliseconds, bilinguals take longer, even if you ask them to do this in their dominant language. So pick the language you're most comfortable in and do the task, you still take longer. More of those tip-of-the-tongue experiences that I mentioned earlier, where you have to remember the name of an unusual object. And on a test where I say, okay, I want you to name all of the kinds of fruit you can think of in the next 60 seconds, go. Bilinguals name fewer, reliably. Yes.
So why is that? Like bilinguals are like much lower than monolinguals?
I've come to that.
Oh.
Okay? That's the key question, because it's counterintuitive, so I will try to address that. All right, here's just a little bit of data on this point. Here's a lexical retrieval task that we used. We took the Boston naming task, which is a standardized task to name pictures, and we created 2 versions. We gave it in the usual version, where you see pictures like this, and you name them as rapidly as you can. And we created a definition version, sort of more verbal, where we made up short definitions, small, narrow, bow with pointy ends, tall, woody plant, and so forth. So participants would actually do both. They would get some of the items in the picture condition and some in the definition condition, because we wanted to see if that made a difference. Maybe it was confounded with figuring out what the definitions were. So here's what we found. We had 96 participants who were monolingual or bilingual and younger or older. So there's 24 in each group. And they got both versions of that task. And these are all matched on everything we can possibly match them on. Okay? And here's what happens on that very simple task to name things like canoe, tree, and so on. Now again, bilinguals are in blue and monolinguals are in red. And this time, solid bars are the young people, and the hash bars are the older people. And here I'm just reporting the number correct. How many of these items can they come up with before they have a complete retrieval failure, like, oh, yes, spatula, okay? So there's no difference that's significant between definitions and pictures. But the main result is that the monolinguals are more accurate than the bilinguals at both age groups in both conditions. It's just a part of being bilingual that it's harder to dive in and quickly come up with a specific vocabulary item. And here's one last example. This is part of a larger experiment where we just basically gave monolinguals and bilinguals who are younger and older a list of 20 words to remember. And then we did all sorts of crazy and confusing things, but I'm only going to tell you about the very simple condition. Here are 20 words, remember them. Okay, and they all belong to the same semantic category. So how many of these words can people remember? And again, these people, they're all matched on everything. There's no reason for them to do any differently. And here are the results. Again, monolinguals in red, bilinguals in blue. Now this time, older people are recalling fewer of the words than younger people. These are scores out of 20. So the best group, the monolingual young people, are only getting about 10.5 out of 20. It's a hard task. But there's also a significant language experience effect. So within each age group, bilinguals recall significantly fewer words. So something as simple as remembering a list of words is less successfully performed for bilinguals than monolinguals matched on everything else.
What interaction? What is no interaction?
Sorry?
What does that mean, no interaction?
Oh, it means that the amount of difference between monolinguals and bilinguals is the same in both groups. So it's not like the older bilinguals are especially worse. The two age groups show exactly the same difference statistically between monolinguals and bilinguals. Is that clear now? All right, so we have a deficit in lexical access for bilinguals that I will say at this point reflects a different representation. They know fewer words, the interconnections among those words are less rich, those associations are less strong, and that's part of the reason that retrieving words for purposes like this is more problematic for bilinguals, and this is across all ages. Now here is the key, and here's where I hope to begin to address your question. There's one thing that's very surprising but is now incontrovertible. And I can tell you I've been doing research for a long time, and there are very few things that everyone finally comes to agree on as correct, and this is one of them. And it is this. For bilinguals who really have two languages that they use and can use either, when such a person is using one of their languages, even in a context where only that language is appropriate, the other language is activated, and it is bumping up against the language they're using and interfering with it. It's a surprising finding. It would be more intuitive to think, well, there's a little switch, now I'm speaking English, now I'm speaking French, but there isn't. If you can speak English and French, every time you speak English, French is bumping up against your English. And there's overwhelming evidence for this. It comes from behavioral studies, brain studies, patient studies, and there is, as I said, no contrary evidence. So this is the basic empirical fact. If you're bilingual, both languages are active. And that means you have a problem. Because every time you open your mouth to say a word, there's conflict. Because that word that you want is being annoyed by some word in the other language that you don't want. And so you have a problem to solve. There's competition for selection. But we know that bilinguals manage to speak perfectly normally. They don't just, unless there's a pathology, when this actually does happen. But in the absence of pathology, a bilingual can open their mouth flawlessly in one of their languages. So it means there's a mechanism that's responsible for selection. All right? So if you're bilingual, there's 2 languages, and you now have a cognitive attention selection problem that monolinguals don't have. You've got to stick to the one that's appropriate. So here's the picture I showed you before. Now what we know is that the brain has a perfectly good system whose job it is to resolve competition and select when there's conflict. And that system is the executive control system. And it kicks in for all kinds of conflict. Anytime you have to choose between attending to the color or the shape, or what's on your right or what's on your left, any kind of attention conflict where 2 things are are competing for your attention, the choice you make is handled by the executive control system, which is in the front part of the brain and the frontal lobes, and it is a domain general, brain-wide, mind-wide network. So this means that bilinguals are using that executive control system all the time. We know from research on experience-induced cognitive change, any system that you use massively becomes fortified. It's practice. So if bilinguals are using the executive control system more than monolinguals, that system should be more well developed in bilinguals. Not only that, but as I mentioned, the executive control system is domain general. It's used, it's invoked, it's recruited across all kinds of things that we do, verbal, nonverbal, auditory, musical, all kinds of things. So the effect of using this a lot, the enhancement on the executive control system, should be found throughout all domains of performance. All right, so there's the picture. We have this deficit in lexical access that comes from poor representations, but then recruits this executive control system to resolve the inherent conflict. And therefore, what we predict is that that executive control system is enhanced. That's the prediction. So from the linguistic deficit should emerge a cognitive advantage. Now, so I'm going to show you now in the next few minutes examples of various kinds of studies we've done on this exact point. Can we show an executive control advantage in bilinguals? And I must say, because I don't remember if it's on one of my slides or not, the executive control system is without doubt the most important cognitive system we have. It develops very late in childhood, which is why you cannot get 5-year-olds to sit and focus and not be distracted and multitask. They don't have the brain mechanism yet. And depressingly, it's the first system to begin to decline with aging. We see this cognitively, but the reason is because the front part of the brain is the first system to begin losing its mile and begin atrophying. So it's last in, first out, and it's the most important cognitive system we have. All right, so here's one example of a task that requires this system that we've used across the lifespan. In this task, you look at a computer monitor and you're given a very simple rule. And the rule is you're going to see squares that are either red or green. If you see a red square, press the key on the left. And if you see a green square, press the key on the right. That's the rule, and it's a very simple rule. Now, on the simple trials, these red and green squares just appear in the center of the display. But on the experimental trials, these red and green squares appear on one or the other side, and the side they appear on can either be the same as the rule. So here we have a red square on the left, so you see a flash of light on the left and you have to press a key on the left, so everything is aligned. That's easy to do. But the way we're wired, we respond automatically to position cues, to flashes of light in the periphery. It was a very useful thing in our evolutionary history because it kept the species alive. But we have not changed that wiring. So when a flash of light appears, you are automatically biased to respond on that side. But on half the trials, a green square will appear on the left, but you have to press the right key, okay? So it's more effortful. And the extra time required to do that, and it does take extra time, is called the Simon effect. All right, so we have congruent and incongruent trials. So I'm just going to show you a little bit of data here. Here's a study with children who are about 6 years old. These are reaction times, so higher means slower, and congruent and incongruent trials. So you can see everybody is slower on incongruent than congruent trials, but notice that the monolinguals, these children, are significantly slower in responding to both kinds of trials, even on the congruent ones. Now, just to preempt why that should be, it's because the other thing that executive control enables you to do is switch rapidly, and these congruent and incongruent trials are presented in a mixed block. So you need control just to do it. You'll see this pattern throughout, where there are congruent and incongruent trials in a mixed block. You always have the same effect on both. So those are data from children. Bilingual children, 6 years old, are faster on this utterly nonverbal task. Here's data from middle-aged people doing the same task, and data from older people doing the same task. Now what you can see, if you just glance through these graphs, the pattern is identical. And even more interesting, I think, is if you look at the scale here, 700, I've plotted 1,000 milliseconds of time on all the graphs, but I've had to adjust it because young adults are faster. But if you look at the children and the older adults, I was able to plot them on the same scale. So there's some kind of symmetry about that. But the pattern is identical. The bilinguals are always faster. And the reason is because of this need to control, to inhibit, and to switch that this task presents. All right, now here's some audience participation, because I think you'll understand the task. Even if you've read about this task or seen the task, you don't really get it until you've tried it. So please humor me and be subjects. All right, I'm going to show you words, and you have to name the color of the ink. Do not read the word. Name the color of the ink as fast as you can, out loud. Do not read the word.
Red, blue, green, red, green,
Blue. Easy, right? Okay? That's called the Stroop task. And it's a very reliable measure of executive control, because you can't prevent yourself from reading the word. You just can't. So as much as you know you have to say blue, red is just screaming at you. And that's what makes this task hard. So we gave this task to monolinguals and bilinguals because that's exactly the same problem. You know, there's two kinds of responses you want to make, and only one of them is right. So we have different conditions here. I'm not going to bother you with that. Let's just get to the main thing. But this is just control conditions. There's no good difference. Okay, here's the main thing. And I plotted this slightly differently. I've just taken the extra time you need to give the answer in that incongruent condition. So it's the difference between saying blue when the word is blue and saying blue when the word is green. All right? Well, what was that? Oh, disappeared, right? I didn't imagine. All right, we did 2 studies. Here's study 1. And again, the same color scheme for these. Now, these are the differences in time. So a higher bar is a bigger difference, more problem with the task, okay? A lower bar means I can do this. I can avoid saying what the word is. So you can see that older adults, this is just a harder task altogether. That's well documented in the literature. But again, within each age group, there's a large and reliable effect showing that bilinguals find this easier to do. And then we did it again in a completely other study, and we got identical results. So in both younger and older adults, it's easier for bilinguals to avoid the misleading cue and give the required response. Yes?
Have you done research on like multilingual people? Like, I don't know, are they faster?
That's an interesting question. There's very little research on multilingual people. We've done things like this. It's actually in study 1. Some of these older bilinguals were actually multilinguals. Now, we didn't set up the study that way, but we went back retrospectively and divided this group into people who spoke 2 languages or people who spoke 3 or more languages and compared them, and there was no difference at all. But the study wasn't designed to test that, so the subsamples weren't even. There's a teeny bit of evidence that more languages are better, but we've never found that in our studies. All right, so here's this picture I showed you. And now I want to come back to understand what's going on here. So this is the key. It's the executive control system that is used to resolve competition across all domains, that both leads to both the deficits and the advantages. This stands in the middle of the deficits and the advantages. So a deficit in linguistic access ironically produces an advantage in nonverbal executive control. Now, conflict, just look back at this picture, the reason this is in the center is because there's conflict. This system is there because conflict is detected. So how does conflict stand as the common link across these very different domains? So you just think of it in a very simple schematic. Take a simple picture naming task, all right? There's a picture, and you have to name it as fast as possible, and you're a French-English bilingual. So given what I told you about both languages being active, when you see that picture, that's what your mind is doing. But the instruction, the context, says that's the right answer, avoid saying the other. So 2 responses are salient, you have to choose one. Now, think about the Simon task. It looks like a very different task, but structurally it's equivalent. You have a rule, red press left, green press right. There is a green patch on the left, and so 2 responses are activated. The position says choose left, the rule says choose right, you have a conflict, and you have to choose one of them. So in fact, the kind of mental resolution that's required in these 2 very different situations is very similar. And my further claim is that both of them are handled by the same system, by this executive control system. Now I'm going to just show you one more kind of wild and crazy task, because you don't often get stopped on the street and asked to do a Stroop test, right? I would assume this is the first time this has happened to you. But we do things all the time that require this system. So I'm going to show you one piece of data from a much more complex simulation of a real-life task. This is a task where we created a simulation of cooking a complex breakfast, and people had to plan, remember, monitor, attend. It was really terrible. I mean, they really hated us. You had to cook breakfast, set a table, remember to turn foods on and off, and it was all instantiated on a touchscreen computer. And we had our usual 4 groups. Now, there's 3 conditions, and I'm just going to try to explain the task using this display, which is what participants saw in the simplest condition. So you're told, okay, you're going to have to make breakfast. Now here you have, well, let's start over here. Here you have 5 foods. I don't know if you can see it or not. You have 5 foods. You have eggs, sausages, and so on. Each food requires a different amount of time to cook. Okay? So the eggs need 5.5 minutes, the sausages 3.5. These are totally made up numbers, as anybody who's tried to make breakfast will know. Each food has a start button and a stop button. So you start the food cooking by pressing start, and then this little blue thermometer is a timer that runs down in real time, and then when the eggs are ready, you've got to hit stop so they don't burn. So you have to start and stop each food. Now the main instruction you're given is everything has to be ready at the same time. How many times I have served potatoes for dessert, I can't tell you. But they had to get all the foods to finish cooking at the same time without burning them. So you have to actually remember to hit stop. Now, in your spare time, while food is cooking, you have to set the table. And the way you do it is you hit an item, a plate, and then you hit where you want it to go, place setting, blah, 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 and you set these places. And as soon as it's all set, it just all bounces back and you start all over again, because we want to know how many place settings can actually be set. Okay, so it's a very complex multitasking situation. Remember to start and stop foods. Everything has to finish at the same time, and set as many places as you can. Don't burn the foods, okay? This is the easy condition because it's all right in front of you. We had 2 other conditions where we split off the screens. So in the other 2 conditions, all you would see on the main screen is the table and the list of foods. And in the middle condition, you either saw all the foods on one screen, so you could either be doing cooking or table setting. But in the really, really awful, they hate us condition, every food had its own screen and you had to switch back and forth. Okay, so you get the idea, right? It's hard, there's a lot of stuff to remember. All right, here's what we found. A lot of the things we looked at are simple remembering. You have to remember to start the foods at the right time. You have to remember that the eggs take 5 minutes and so on. And at starting the foods at the appropriate time, there's no difference between groups. Everyone can remember equally. You have to remember to stop the foods. It's a simple memory task. I put the eggs on 2.5 minutes ago. I have to stop them. And you can check back and forth as long as you like. No difference between groups. How many times do they check? No difference. How many places do they set? No difference. So the memory measures are identical. But one other thing that we could look at is how they allot the time. So there's a tendency, especially with aging, to find switching hard. I'm doing this, I have to disengage and shift and then do something else. And if I can do that easily, then I'm always doing the right thing at the right time. But if switching is hard, then I will be caught doing the wrong thing because I couldn't switch. Switching is handled by the executive control system, and I'll give you more data on this later. So switching between tasks is a very standard executive control measure. And so in this experiment, there are really 2 basic tasks. There's cooking and table setting. And so we can look at how they switch between them. Now they're performing each to the same level of accuracy, but they're not switching the same. So the monolinguals are significantly more often caught out at the table when they should be watching the food. They can't switch. That's the difference. There's no memory difference. There's no knowledge difference. There's the ability to multitask. That's different. So bilinguals are better at switching between tasks, and that effect was found in younger and older samples, but it was much larger in the older adults.
Sorry, is there a reason behind, like, I don't know, maybe some parts of brain lit up if bilingual than monolingual, right? That like they perform better in this one. Like, is there more, I don't know, biological reason, I guess, to this?
Well, I don't. First of all, we don't have any imaging data on this task. I mean, it's a very complex task. I don't know how you would do this in an imaging setup, but I think just speculating from our behavioral data, they're using their executive control system more efficiently. Because of all these measures, the only one that requires executive control is switching between the two tasks. And that's the only one the bilinguals do better at. Memory is all medial temporal kinds of stuff. Switching is frontal kinds of stuff. That's the only place where there's a language difference. So, but I don't have any great memory. Okay, so that's all very nice in healthy people, but how broad is this impact? So I've shown you several experiments where we look at older adults, and we see that older bilinguals continue to show the cognitive advantage that we find in younger bilinguals. But what happens when aging is not normal? What happens when so I'm going to look at two studies we did with the onset of dementia. It's well accepted now, I think, that cognitive reserve protects one against cognitive decline in both normal and pathological aging. These are things like do crossword puzzles, take music lessons, join a social group. That stimulating activity is strongly protective against all kinds of cognitive aging, including cognitive decline with dementia. So we wanted to see if bilingualism is perhaps one factor that contributes to cognitive reserve. As I told you, being bilingual means you're using more of your brain all the time. And maybe that's sufficient to create a situation that produces cognitive reserve. So what we did is look in both studies that I'm going to show you. We went into the Baycrest Clinic and looked at records of patients who were diagnosed with dementia. We took note of background information, language history, and so on, and recorded as much as we could about their past, and then considered how old they were when symptoms of dementia first became apparent. Now in study one, only 2/3 of the patients had probable Alzheimer's disease, but in study two, they were all, we restricted it to all probable AD patients, just to make it a more homogeneous sample. Study one was published a couple of years ago. Study two is just being submitted now. But the procedures are the same. So here's what we find. The PowerPoint isn't working. There we go. Here's the data for study one. We have 91 patients who we classified as monolingual and 93 as bilingual. We did not select them. You go into almost any public facility in Toronto and half the people will be bilingual. This is the best place in the world to do this research. We looked at how long between the time the families noticed a problem and their clinic appointment. maybe bilinguals who are more likely to be immigrants, delay making an appointment, don't go to the clinic, resist seeking help, but there's no difference in how long they waited. Now, this one is important. Years of formal education is one of the factors known to be protective against dementia. The more years of formal education, the more protection you have. But you'll notice here, the monolinguals have more years of education, and it's significant. So if anything, the monolinguals should be older. Now, I would not make too much of this because most of the bilinguals who were born for this sample around between 1920 and 1930, many of the bilinguals were born in Europe, and the reason they didn't finish their formal education had nothing to do with their brains. Okay. MMSE is a very rough measure of cognitive level. They were identical. There's no statistical difference. Okay, how old were they? The monolinguals were 71 and a half. The bilinguals were 75 and a half, and that is hugely significant. A very large difference in this kind of research. Say, okay, it was a fluke. So we did a new study. We went back to the records, subsequent records. So those records were up to about 2006. We went back and started selecting patients who came after that time, so we got this a whole new sample, but from the same hospital. Now we have 109 monolinguals and 102 bilinguals, all of them diagnosed with probable AD. Years duration, I think you can see these are identical numbers. If anything, monolinguals are waiting a little longer, so they should be a little bit older. Interestingly, years of education is identical, and I think for the same reason. Okay, MMSE scores identical. I mean, this is an astounding replication. I just have to say, we try to replicate stuff all the time, and if you sort of get close, you say, yeah, it's close, right? But these are like almost bang-on results from a new group. All right, how old were they? Monolinguals were 72 and a half, and the bilinguals were 77 and a half, and that too is significant. Now, why are they a little bit older? I only have one speculation, and that is, in the last few years, when younger people, which is to say people in their 60s, show up at the clinic with these symptoms, recently, they are less likely now to be diagnosed as probable AD and more likely to be diagnosed as mild cognitive impairment, which then converts to AD. So the youngest people in each group have been peeled off because of changes in diagnostic practices between the times we did these two studies. And so when you take off the youngest one, the mean just climbs up a bit. But you can see there's absolutely no confounding the group. This is the effect, okay? All right, now if you start showing symptoms later, do you fall off a cliff, decline faster? We don't really know, but here's just a little bit of data we have. So the red line, these are MMSE scores across 4 years post-diagnosis on a subsample of patients that we had. So here's years 1, 2, 3, 4, and the solid lines are monolingual, the bilinguals are dashed lines. They decline at the same rate. So it's not that if you can hold off till you're a little older that the decline is faster, the decline seems to be the same. Here's more data from another group. This is a group in California who had a very small sample of monolinguals and bilinguals. This is their MMSE, this is their age. The interesting thing here is that all the bilinguals are Spanish-English, and so they could do something that we could not do. They calculated a degree of bilingualism score by creating a ratio. So a Spanish vocabulary score over an English vocabulary score. So the closer that score is to 1, the more bilingual the patient is, okay? here's the graph. So here's 0, here's 1. So 1 is more bilingual, 0 is there's a very big imbalance. This is hard to read. But the point is there's a significant correlation showing the more bilingual you are, the bigger the delay. So the bigger the protection, which kind of relates to your question in a different sort of way. That people who are more bilingual just with 2 languages are getting more protection than people who are less balanced. All right, so what can we say? We can see that with aging, as I said, there's a general slowing of all responses. Cognition suffers with age. Make no mistake, it isn't pretty. The greatest impact of aging on cognition is in the executive control system. It becomes increasingly difficult to inhibit interfering information, certainly switching, as you saw in the breakfast task, and most definitely multitasking. I can no longer multitask. If I try to do 2 things at the same time now, I guarantee one of them will be a disaster. I can't do it anymore. So the executive control system is central to all higher thought for all these reasons. And the bilinguals use this system not only for all of the usual purposes, but additionally to manage attention to their 2 language systems. And that lifelong practice has this extraordinary beneficial effect across a broad range of tasks. There's other research that looks at experience and its beneficial effects on cognition, and I just want to position this. So we know that using behavioral studies, architects are better than non-architects on visual spatial tasks. Video game players are better than non-game players on tasks that require fast perceptual motor coordination. There's brain studies showing, modifications of brain systems in musicians. The London taxi drivers is cool. You know that to get a taxi license in London, you have to memorize the London A to Z. You have to know where every little alleyway is in London. Well, there's a part of the brain that we use for spatial navigation. It's a little piece of the hippocampus. And if you do brain imaging of London taxi drivers, turns out their hippocampi are bigger than mere mortals. So these are all changes in cognition or brain that come from experience. But they're all selected. You don't know if it's only people with big hippocampi that are able to pass that London taxi test, or that only people who are particularly talented in visual spatial skills become architects. You don't know, but you do know that that's not true for bilinguals. Bilinguals are not pre-selected. Bilinguals, for the vast majority of bilinguals, are so because life makes them so, not because they started with a special talent. So there is no pre-selection. So it is, in fact, the best example of experience-induced cognitive change because it's an unselected random population. And we know that bilingualism modifies cognitive networks. It may also modify brain structures. We're looking at that now. So I want to end with this. It seems that in terms of what bilingualism enables you to do, I've mentioned a few times, multitasking is right up there. And this is part of our fast-paced life, right? Multitasking. So this is an experiment we did a few years ago. I don't think we'd be able to do it now because it's now illegal. What is the one multitasking thing that we probably all used to do, not anymore, maybe, and that is, okay, driving while talking to myself, okay? It was the only time I ever spoke to my mother, actually. I still do, but I have a little piece of it. All right, so we did a little study. The graduate student, Jason Tellner. So we looked at driving. Yeah, Jason had a driving simulator set up, and he worked out an experiment where you get a score for safe driving on the simulator, And in other conditions, there were 4 different verbal tasks that you had to perform while driving. So you did the tasks separately, and then you did them together. So while driving, you had to do each one of these 4 verbal tasks. These are all young adults. They were 35 monolinguals, 41 bilinguals. They were all undergraduate university students. And everybody performed identically when they did the tasks individually. And here's what happens when they do them together. Now, what's plotted here is the percentage to which they're worse on each of the verbal tasks if they're doing them while they're driving. So a bigger number means they're more worse. They're worser. They're more impacted. So these are the 4 verbal tasks. Doesn't matter what they are. And on each one of the 4, the performance of the monolinguals takes a bigger hit than the performance of the bilinguals in each case. And I leave you then with a test.
Do we have to pass the test?
Yeah.
I flunked. It's a big resounding no.
Sorry?
It's a big resounding no.
Well, I would think so, right? I mean, that's not why that picture was on the internet, but it just seemed appropriate.